Well, hello. So today I want to talk about a particularly tragic issue, the suicide of Sweden. Sweden is undoubtedly one of the creme de la creme nations of Earth, a near idyllic nation with beautiful people, a rich culture, low corruption, and a high functioning, high trust society. Alas, all that is at risk today of not only being lowered in quality, but of being outright wiped off the face of the earth, due to massive levels of MENA and African migration. The country is racing ahead of all its peers to commit national seppuku by doubling down on the migration issue, censoring all dissident voices and producing an endless stream of excuses for the inexcusable behavior of the migrants. Sweden is now the rape capital of Europe, with cities like Malmö and Stockholm increasingly resembling war zones, with frequent grenade attacks, gang violence, and terrorism reminiscent of sub-Saharan Africa. Worse, in the recent 2018 general election, Swedes re-elected the Social Democrats responsible for the mess, and the right-wing Sweden Democrats only got 17.7% of the vote, coming in a third, and have been long since trapped in a cordon sanitaire, where all other political parties refuse cooperation with them. Even their Nordic neighbors, Norway, Finland, and Denmark, have had right-wing populist governments, and have largely avoided the migrant crisis. In Denmark, the Social Democrats only regained power after surrendering to the right on the migrant issue. The same is true for Finland, where the populist right fell 0.2% short of becoming the largest party. On continental Europe, save for Germany, all the countries have strong right-wing populist movements, in many cases in government, like the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Austria, Italy, and Switzerland. Plus, no country has truly done so much to censor its population, save for the UK and Canada. This is particularly strange considering that Sweden has no guilty history. The Germans are heavily guilt-tripped for their role in the world wars, and others have colonial pasts, but Sweden is squeaky clean. Yet they are the most guilt-ridden and self-hating. And this travesty isn't something new. For decades they have led the world in feminism and girl power. It is the only state where social democrats have ruled continuously for 100 years, and is the only EU country where they still rule as the largest party. The Spanish and Greek left are collapsing, with the Greek having recently been kicked out of power by the New Democracy Party. Rape and terror by MENA migrants in Sweden is something that dates back all the way to 2004, long before the rest of Europe caught up to it. Plus, Sweden is literally known as the world's humanist superpower and has a party solely devoted to feminism, and it gets 2 to 3% of the vote, while the nationalist alternative for Sweden only gets 1% of the vote. So the issue is, why is Sweden so cucked? My theory is that it's more genetic than cultural. The cultural explanation of Viking altruism really doesn't cut it when you think about Norway and Finland. Plus, there's the issue of the hook-nosed Bonnier family controlling most of Swedish media, but the same is true for Italy and France as well, and they have strong right-wing movements. It is the men's job in any nation to protect their people, and the men of Sweden have failed consistently to do their duty. It's really jarring how a nation that produced these men are now stuck with these guys. How did the nation of Vikings, Carolus Rex and Gustav Adolphus come to this? The Swedish Vikings went east, unlike the Danes and Norwegians who raided west. The lands the Swedish Vikings raided were in France, Holland, and England, much more densely populated with strong monarchies who raised large armies to repel Viking invasions. Thus they never really settled substantially, as the local kingdoms were too large to be pushed aside, too densely populated to settle in large numbers, and always raised strong armies to crush them. Plus, the Vikings mostly were light infantry who were suited for raiding, and were unable to stand up to the established armies of England and France in open battle as they lacked heavy cavalry to stop them. There was never heavy colonization in those lands, and the Vikings were mostly forced to return. There are minor exceptions like East Anglia and Normandy which were given to them by royal decree. The Swedes on the other hand went east to Russia. Russia at the time was filled with hundreds of squabbling tribes, who were too isolated and too disjointed to offer strong resistance, and there were massive amounts of empty land which the Swedes managed to occupy, and the Swedish men thus found it much easier to settle in Russia. This happened over many generations. For nearly 3 centuries continuously, some of the bravest, manliest, and most adventurous men went east to settle in Russia or Byzantium. The whole term Rus comes from the boats the Swedish Vikings would sail in the Russian rivers. Thus the Swedes lost many of its best men to Russian women, and their genes mostly went to Russia, and this happened continuously for nearly 12 to 15 generations. But this is the secondary reason. The real blow came to Sweden in the 17th century. Sweden became a great power by 1600, and for the next century it was involved in a relentless series of wars. From 1600 to 1648 it was at war non-stop. Now all countries were at war, but Sweden's case was different as it had mainly a mercenary and voluntary system. These armies were staffed with Sweden's manliest, bravest, and strongest men, as only the most daring ones would volunteer to enlist as a mercenary. And Sweden fielded disproportionately large armies in respect to its population. For example, Sweden in the Thirty Years' War in 1630 fielded an army of 150,000 men. It had a total population of about 2.5 million, and this was including its vassals Finland and Latvia. That meant that a full quarter of its able-bodied male population were sent to war. The only reason it could do so is because France bankrolled it at the time, as Cardinal Richelieu didn't want to fight fellow Catholics himself. The Swedes fought mainly from 1630 to 1635 and lost about 110,000 troops. These men all perished in the blood-soaked fields of the Holy Roman Empire. And this war continued for a generation, eating up many more Swedish men. And disproportionately, and then came the Second Northern War, which raged from 1655 to 1660, that saw Sweden lose some 70,000 men in about 5 years. Again, a huge loss considering a small population base. And again, most likely many Swedish soldiers settled in Poland after getting fat with the loot. And then there was the Scanian War and other small wars. But the massive blow came in the form of the Great Northern War, which raged from 1700 to 1721, with major fighting really ending in 1710. So fighting mainly lasted for about 10 years. In this war, Sweden lost 200,000 men, again out of a very small population base in a very short period of time. This damage came at the tail end of a century where Sweden fielded armies disproportionate in respect to its population. To give some context, in the Thirty Years' War, France, a country of 20 million people, fielded an army of 120,000 men. Austria, with about 8 to 11 million people, fielded 150,000 men, and Spain, with about 10 million people, fielded an army of 300,000 men. So what we see is that due to massive armies being disproportionately being fielded by Sweden and suffering massive casualties, it lost most of its most masculine, daring, and adventurous men. And as these major wars took place one generation after the other, in every generation the top 5 to 10% of the most masculine Swedish men perished, which had a greater impact than if only 50% of the best men died in a single war. In every generation, the top 5 to 10% of the case-selected men would perish in the various wars, thus having a much larger additive impact on the gene pool. Sweden was essentially under an aggressive dysgenics program for 5 generations that spanned the breadth of its era as a European great power. The real Swedish men all died in the fields of Germany, Russia, and Poland, or they left Sweden earlier to become Russians, leaving Sweden with the lesser men. Thus the weak, conforming, the less manly ones were left with the gorgeous Swedish women, and most Swedes today are descended from them. Germany, France, and Russia all suffered huge casualties in many wars, but most of these losses were civilians, and the military losses they suffered were insignificant compared to the population base. In Sweden's case, it fought relentlessly and outsized wars for nearly a century, where nearly all of its finest men went to war and died. Sweden essentially underwent an aggressive dysgenics project from 1618 to 1721, and add to this the loss of Viking chads to Russian women in the Viking era. More is lost in war than money and laborers. Wars also cost you genes, the genes of your best men. This is a constant theme throughout history, where a conquering tribe becomes undone by its own success. The Rio Romans, the elites, all died in the civil wars of the late Republic, and later became Mongolized. The bravest Arabs conquered the Middle East and settled there, and became Mongol Iraqis and Levantines. The same happened with the Mongols and the Turks in China and Anatolia respectively. This is a lesson that excess militarism and immigration is dangerous and can lead to the destruction of the gene pool. Many people like Stefan Molyneux will mourn that the world wars killed out the strong white men, but that is just plainly wrong. Only France and Germany suffered huge military losses in proportional to its population in World War One, and in World War Two only Germany and Russia lost a lot of military men. But those were conscript armies where brave and coward alike were forced to fight at the same time. There was no selective pressure, and the wars only affected one generation of men in any given country, with the exception of Germany, where it was mauled by two world wars in two generations. War can be glorious. It can bring you land, riches, women, and glory, but have too much of it and you will lose the flower of your nation to the engine of war. Thanks for watching.